thank you. How do the old preachers say it? When you're clapping at the beginning, it's an act of hope. Okay. But anyway, good evening to each and every one of you. This is really quite an honor. Jim, I miss him. You know, it's just, you can't help it. And I want to say thank you to Dean Douglas, President Jones, and to all of your staff members. You have quite a few people, and I try to call the names of everyone with whom I spoke and who is archived in my telephone, so that if I'm ever in trouble in New York City at 2:00 in the morning, I have people to call and I know their names. But I want to just say thank you to all of you who have made it possible, got the cars, got me there and everything. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And greetings to all of you. This lecture is basically, very basically, a celebration of the Golden Jubilee of the publication of James Hal Cone's The Spirituals and the Blues, an Interpretation. For many of us who are not theologians, and remember, I'm a sociologist. I have to tell you a secret. Oh no, wait a minute, this is being broadcast, never mind. I'll tell you during the reception. Remind me of the theology secret, okay. Okay, but I'm not a theologian. For many of us who are not theologians, that book, and for me it was, a gateway into the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary study of Black religion and the Black church. This is part of a larger project tentatively titled The Greatest Gift, a personal introduction to sorrow songs, freedom songs, and everything in between. And it comes from my experience. I've been teaching at Colby College since 1987. And I told my students, there's a certain course that they take where we try to, it's called African American Culture in the United States. Now, right away, you know, that's too much for one semester, okay. But as I tell them, borrowing from Zora Neale Hurston's recounting of a preacher who got up to preach and said, children, we're going to jump at the sun, and if we land among the moon and the stars, we will still be on higher ground. And, you know, there are all these different theories of culture. And I would say we're going to take into account all these different theories of culture. But I am going to use one theory of culture that your parents used when they dragged you to the symphony, that theory of exposure. And I told them, you will know what a spiritual is when you leave this class. And it is because of Jim Cone's book that I actually wanted to teach the course in order to talk about the spirituals. And I actually wrote out the lecture for them so we could play lots of music. So this is an example of this lecture that they got. And this project is part of this, okay, about 32 pages long. And I still kept talking, even though I wrote it out. But so this is from this larger project. In the midst of all of this, your invitation to provide this lecture coincided with Robert Greenberg's invitation to write a foreword for this 50th anniversary. So I am unimaginably grateful to Kelly Brown Douglas, Serene Jones for this opportunity and honor. I do hope that God allows Jim Cone and Katie Cannon to look over the battlements of heaven and be special beams for tonight's lecture. This is also a warning that this is a work in progress. You know what it means when we say this is a work in progress. And it at times may come across as the words of one legendary Black preacher said, a few scattering remarks. If you take nothing away from this lecture, please take this. One point. James Hal Cone participated in and contributed to a revolution in knowledge about Africans, their American descendants, their shaping of the modern world, and the institutions, structures, and processes that enslaved and oppressed people formed by celebrating what W.E.B. Du Bois called their greatest gift. And that's where the phrase greatest gift comes from. And Du Bois's ever-present question, what message do these people have for the world? My epigraph is very simple. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Nobody knows my sorrow. So familiar. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Glory, hallelujah. And then, trouble in mine, I'm blue. But I won't be blue always. Why? Because the sun's going to shine in my back door someday. The 1972 publication of James Cone's The Spirituals and the Blues occurred at one of the most propitious moments in the history of African American studies, especially regarding the study of history, music, and African American cultural capital. Cone's work not only generated new opportunities for the exploration of the spirituals, but offered a new conceptualization of the blues, calling them secular spirituals, placing them alongside late 19th and early 20th century sacred music traditions and pointing to the way these music traditions all spoke to the issues of African American suffering and dislocation. This lecture will explore the ways that the spirituals and the blues made possible a revival of relevance for the spirituals in both classrooms, my classroom, and contemporary scholarship. I'm going to try to focus on the ways that insights from the spirituals and the blues provided opportunities for me in my teaching, writing, and research. James Cone's work helped to facilitate a revolution in academia. We know that. He created a whole new disciplinary area. We could just talk about that, but I'll continue. With just the focus on spirituals, he made it possible to renew, restore, and extend multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary conversations about African American origins and destinies, and the agency of enslaved African Americans in shaping these. And are we not still having debates over origins? The 1619 Project being a case in point. It will also, I will also explore the continuing importance, as demonstrated by Cone, of the spirituals and blues as insights into African American personal and collective spiritual agency within and beyond the Black church. I'm going to draw on my experiences in my course. I've already mentioned that course that I teach at a PWI, a predominantly white institution, using Cone's work as a foundation for exploring the spirituals, and from my research into the role of African American orature, spirituals, and folklore in shaping a shared religious imagination, especially regarding the Bible. The spirituals and the blues represents a persistent and enduring witness to the sustained value of the work of James Cone, and it provides a significant foundation for asking new questions in a world where insisting that Black Lives Matter remains a source of intense political debate and cultural warfare. Macedonia AME and Union Baptist Church. Okay, like James Cone, I grew up in the Black church. The church of my childhood, however, was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where when I was 8 years old, I joined the junior choir. One Sunday, the junior choir, seeking more contemporary gospel music. Now, this is, when I say contemporary, this is 1956, okay? Seeking more contemporary gospel music, what they call, one of them's called something bumping, okay? They decided to go on strike. Because my mother and the classically trained choir director were best friends, I ended up being the lone singing strike breaker that Sunday morning. Now, you have to understand that most of the choir members also were her nieces and nephews. So the complexity of growing up in the Black church. But their parents didn't force them to be strike breakers. Plus, they were all 3 and 4 years older than I was. Another long story I won't go into. Since the choir members were older, they understood my problem and did not hold my strike breaking against me. My terrifying first ever church solo was a spiritual. Often titled Witness, my solo asked the question, who will be a witness for my Lord? And the proper response in the call and response tradition was, oh, I'll be a witness for my Lord. Oh, you read in the Bible and you understand that Samson was a strong man, and it goes on. Joshua was all of those verses. And I had to sing all the verses all by myself in front of the congregation. As a 10-year-old of the 1950s, I knew nothing of the theological, historical, cultural, biblical, and socio-musicological matrix attached to my song. I just knew I was absolutely terrified. I now know the question of witness is embedded in every struggle, academic or popular, to ask and answer questions about the African-American experience in America. James Cone's book is one of the most powerful 20th century answers to the challenging question from the enslaved, who will be a witness? And also, what is the content of your witness? What stories are you going to tell? It is, after 50 years, an enduring witness. Cone's work establishes that theology must contain the witness of enslaved Africans and their descendants. They have a voice through their music in the serious questions of theology. The Spirituals and the Blues, the book is a link in a chain of intellectual custody of the spirituals and their study from slavery through freedom, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, and the era of Black power, and now in the struggles we have to relitigate so much of what we thought we had achieved. Cone used Europe and its theological resources to construct theologies of Black power and liberation in his first two books. After throwing open the doors of inclusion in the academy, Cone then uses African America to construct a Black theology that carries the message of the enslaved to the world, and to connect that theology to the larger world of Black agency and meaning by conceiving of the blues as a secular spiritual. That part of the book is absolutely revolutionary. Beyond the doors of Macedonia AME, a church to which Cone bears witness in all of his books, but especially in the Spirituals and the Blues, as a treasure chest of sacred music tradition, there was this secular world of blues and juke joints. The church of my childhood often used the anthem and concert versions of spirituals, unless it was our gospel chorus who was singing. Then we heard the spirituals in the relatively new format of gospel music, something bumping, okay? We were carefully taught the difference between the sacred hand clapping rhythms of gospel music and the secular finger snapping rhythms of blues. Literally, sometimes we'd be in choir rehearsal and want to go boom, and somebody would grab your hand and go. So, how is the socialization carried out, with the sacred and the secular? That it happens. Unlike Macedonia AME Church of Bearden, Arkansas, Union Baptist Church in Cambridge was a setting where cultural constituencies were contesting the appropriate or proper ways to worship. In the 1970s, we were still at war over drums in the service, so that'll give you an idea. Okay. The senior choir sat above, and the gospel chorus sat below. The senior choir was in the choir loft, the gospel chorus sat on the floor next to the piano. Gospel singers from other churches often complained about how dead my church was. When our junior choir visited other churches, however, we discovered that compared to our dead church, there were congregations full of fire. They also sang spirituals with long and extended blue notes and rearranged as gospel songs accompanied by drums and other instruments besides the piano. As children, we learned about our diversity as a people, and that diversity was negotiated through the music in our sacred spaces. As teenagers, we also learned music in secular spaces and discovered that nice Theola Kilgore rhythm and blues song, The Love of My Man, now one of my favorites, and The Love of My God could be sung to the very same tune and beat with lots of the same words. One time, one of my students raised her hand. She said, Professor Jilks, do you like contemporary gospel music? Now they're talking about the 1990s, right? And I'm saying, I like contemporary gospel music. I said, I just don't want the song to make me want to grab the nearest deacon and do a slow drag across the front of the church. At which point another student raised her hand. I said, yes. She said, Professor Jukes, what's a slow drag? Now you know the problem of teaching at a PWI, okay? Trouble in mind, I'm blue, and nobody knows the trouble I see. Blues and spirituals meet and embrace in James Cone's propitious, revolutionary, and enduring work. This book emerged, he said, as a battle cry from what he called his blue room, the room in his basement in Adrian, Michigan, where Cone scribbled notes and thought deeply about what I was going to write, while at the same time listening to Black music, the sonorous sounds of Mahalia Jackson and B.B. King, Aretha Franklin, and Bobby Blue Bland. In the midst of writing about Black power and liberation, okay, what am I doing wrong here? Oh, I moved my little cursor and now it won't obey me. Okay, now we've got it back under control. In the midst of writing about Black power, liberation, the limitations of reconciliation before justice, and answering and learning from his critics, Black and white, James Cone wrote The Spirituals and the Blues to show that Black liberation theology was not derived primarily from European theology. Refusing to bow to his Eurocentric critics, Cone returned to Macedonia AME Church in Bearden, Arkansas, to immerse himself in the world that had shaped his consciousness. Echoing the combined healing spiritual power of the juke joints and the churches, the book emerged at one of the most important moments in the history of African-American studies, especially regarding the study of history, music, and African-American cultural capital. As both a theologian and a Black preacher, Cone not only brought the full weight of that Western theological tradition to bear, but he also brought his experiences as a Black preacher, nurtured in the heart of the Jim Crow South. As one of my friends pointed out, on April 3rd, 1968, there were two African-American men with doctorates in theology. One held an academic appointment, and the other was the United States' most prominent civil rights leader. Both men were preachers with pastoral experience, and both were preachers responding to sacred callings beyond the pulpit. And both men integrated the spirituals into their public voices as academic theologian and civil rights leader. On April 5th, 1968, there was only one left, James Cone. Cone's battle cry eventually became a prelude and pathway to a universal application of Black theology in God of the Oppressed. So this book, this beautiful book, not only expanded opportunities for the exploration, analysis, and interpretation of the spirituals, but offered a new conceptualization of the blues. And this is revolutionary, calling them the secular spirituals, placing them alongside late 19th and 20th century sacred music traditions, and pointing to the way these music traditions all spoke to the issues of Black suffering and dislocation with what W.E.B. Du Bois called, quote, a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things, end quote. In 1903, Du Bois, in what Cone cited as the irreplaceable gem of interpretation, that's what he called Du Bois's analysis of the spirituals, an irreplaceable gem of interpretation. Cone insisted that in the sorrow songs, the spirituals, quote, the slave spoke to the world. Actually, Du Bois argued this, and Cone lifted it up. Cone's book arrived with others and conveyed the voices of the enslaved to the center of academic debate. Let me point to what else is going on in 1972 when this book comes out, which is so important. John Blassingame's monograph, The Slave Community, came forth, giving anyone with an interest in slavery a new perspective from the voices of the women and men who endured the institution. Slave community also became a new way of talking about the world of what we now know of as the invisible church. the spaces in which enslaved Christians created and constructed an alternative perspective from that of their torturers and enslavers. Most of you are familiar with that famous spiritual that has that line in it. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. Heaven, heaven. Gonna walk all over God's heaven. Won't need a pass. The evidence of their alternative vision, a revolutionary and contradictory alternative to the worldview of slave-holding priestcraft, is embedded in the spirituals. The approximately 6,000 songs that circulated among Black Christians in oral tradition before the Civil War. We know this number because also in 1972, James Lovell Jr., a scholar whose early work Cone cites, published his masterwork, Black Song, The Forge and the Flame, the story of how the Afro-American spiritual was hammered out. That same year, scholar and revolutionary activist Angela Davis, incarcerated in California and on trial for her life, also published, using limited resources because she was incarcerated, a spectacular article in the Black Scholar that focused on Black women in the community of slaves. Along with Davis's academic illumination, Aretha Franklin's iconic voice gave us the double gospel album, Amazing Grace, with James Cleveland and the Southern California Choir. The music on that album included the Caravans arrangement of the spiritual, Oh Mary, Don't You Weep, Oh Martha, Don't You Moan. This wonderful spiritual that really you can sort of see enslaved African Americans acting like, sort of time traveling as sort of a Greek chorus to speak to Mary and Martha to let them know, don't worry, the same power that was at the Red Sea is here now at Lazarus's grave. Think about, oh Mary, don't you weep. Oh Martha, don't you moan. Why? Because Pharaoh's army got drowned. Everything's gonna be all right, okay? Oh Mary, don't you weep. Although the spirituals and the blues appeared in 1972, that year in 1972, I only read Blassingame and Davis. But at home, I was playing, like Jim in his blue room, I was playing Aretha Franklin's album loudly as I tried to out-sing her when cooking or doing housework. It is a miracle that nobody ever lodged a noise complaint against me, because I did things like that. I was in graduate school taking my very first and only African-American history course, a course that became one of the most significant pathways I would take as a critic of my home field, sociology, especially its failures around analysis and interpretations of the institution of slavery and the experiences of the enslaved. I found myself asking and answering questions about the African-American religious experience that would make me an interdisciplinary partaker and participant in this world of religious studies. When those worlds collided and remade me, revised me, it was James Cone's The Spirituals and the Blues that was the very first theological work I read and cited in one of my very first publications. I had my first two publications came out in 1980. Is anybody here born before 1980? Oh, okay. And one of them was Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. And this other one, which was a total accident, but it was an act of providence that actually connected me with Dr. Cone, was an article I wrote called The Black Church as a Therapeutic Community, Suggested Areas of Research into the Black Religious Experience. Cone affirmed this work for me, and then his work affirmed the value of my own traditions and religious experiences, enabling me to resist my discipline's erasures and misrepresentations of African-American life and history. Now, okay, thank you. To give you an idea, this is a digression and I hope I don't run over too much. when I got my first tenure track job at Boston University, and it was at Boston University that I first met Jim Cohn when he came to speak, and my article had been rejected roundly by a sociology journal. I mean, they threw it on the floor and jumped up and down on it. One of the reviewers went to so much trouble to Xerox marks for me to let me know it was clear I didn't understand what Marx said when he said religion was the opiate of the people. So he actually Xerox marks and included it. So I asked him, I said, and I was in awe. He had come to speak at Marsh Chapel. And you know, hearing him speak, first I was like, Dr. Cohn, would you be willing to read a paper of mine? He goes, yes. And he had me mail it to him. He sent me back a letter on letterhead telling me where to send it. I sent it to the Journal of the Interdenominational Theological Center, and 4 anonymous reviewers wrote, publish no revisions. Okay, I mean, you don't get to publish journal articles with no revisions. Okay, but that happened thanks to Jim Cohn. And because of his witness, I was able to see the themes and the way in which they're reiterated as we work in community. So Cohn also has taken seriously Du Bois's observations. And here's a key point. Cohn took seriously Du Bois's observations about, and I quote Du Bois now, the eloquent omissions and silences, end quote, of the spirituals about, quote, wooing and wedding and love songs, frivolous and light. Cohn writes, the blues are secular in the sense that they confine their attention solely to the immediate and affirm the bodily expressions of Black soul, including its sexual manifestations. They are spirituals because they are impelled by the same search for truth of Black experience. In a very succinct and condensed final chapter, Cohn celebrates these secular spirituals for their embrace of the totality of Black life and their affirmation of Black humanity in the face of immediate absurdity. One of the things that I did with my students, this is another digression, but I always gave them a blues assignment, and their job was, I would give them a little form. They also had to watch a film about the blues, about women in the blues, et cetera. So they got to hear blues music. And then I gave them a form, and they were to go home and make a list of all the things that had bothered them and gotten on their nerve in the past 2 weeks. Then they were to pick something from the list over which they had no power and write a blues. I learned a lot about like undergraduate life at Colby. Yes, I did. And they, yeah, I didn't make them get up and sing it because they would have cut class. Anyway, but all of that is to say, blues and spirituals are in a sense, the good news that in all of our suffering, Black lives matter to God, and those lives must therefore matter to the world. Okay. Very quickly, Cohn's work coincided with an historiographical revolution. Not only did John Blassingame's book come out, and Blassingame is important, and if you haven't read John Blassingame's The Slave Community, you must read it, because there were basically 2 schools of historians. The North was right school that said slavery was so awful it destroyed Black people, and the South was right school. Slavery was a wonderful institution that socialized the savages. Either way, neither school included the voice of the enslaved. Okay, so you got to understand that Blassingame pounded through that. Who else? Albert Rabbitoe. We know slave religion. Michelle Sobel, Traveling On, The Slave's Journey to an Afro-Baptist Faith. And if you read Michelle Sobel, don't read the paperback. Go to the library and get the hardcover version, because the hardcover version, over half of the hardcover version is an appendix with a list of all of the Black pastored Baptist churches that existed before the Civil War. including the Baptist church that was part of the association that gave rise to C.H. Mason out of Mississippi. So the Mount Helm Baptist Association. So the connections between slave religion and the post slavery religious world is there. And it was like hidden in plain sight. And she lists them all that she could find, okay? So North and South, North and South. So Michelle Sobel, Thomas Weber. Thomas Weber is the book, is the one where I took the phrase slaveholding priestcraft, where he talks about the cultural themes that emerge from the slave community. All of this using slave narratives. Angela Davis, I've mentioned her article, I send you back to, and Deborah Gray White's book on the role of women, because a lot of the male authors were fighting with some stereotypes that were male stereotypes, and she said, we need to talk about the women. And you know we always need to talk about the women, right? Okay, not only was Cone's book an important building block in the edifice of Black theology, but Cone's book expanded the conversation between theology and social science and between theology and musicology. For instance, the work of Bernice Johnson Reagan, again, I mentioned John Lovell, and Reverend Dr. Wyatt T. Walker in his work on the African-American music tradition and the connection between spirituals and the praise songs that follow into freedom. Too often, religious thinking about the African-American experience leaps from slavery to the civil rights movement and ignores everything in between. Connections among and between streams of musical expression were often compartmentalized. In a revolutionary observation, Cone identified blues as a secular spiritual and ignited understandings of the multiple settings and multiple ways African-American spirituality is expressed musically. Cone's work placed the blues alongside newer music traditions, such as gospel music, as a significant response, again, to social dislocation in the aftermath of slavery and urban migration. People had questions to raise. We were going to be free. Somebody asked one of the former slaves, what did you think was going to happen after slavery? He said, we thought we were going to be rich. We were going to work as hard for ourselves as we did for our masters. That one brought tears to me. Okay. As part of this discussion, this lecture, we have to talk about the revival of relevance for the spirituals in both classrooms and contemporary scholarship. Before and especially in terms of the survival of the traumas of slavery and its aftermath in America. An aftermath that is still evident in contemporary life. Before the recent psychological explorations of the impact of trauma, Cone pointed to the ways these songs also serve as tools for personal responses to trauma and for social protests. For instance, I used to ask my psych majors, we go over the lyrics. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Nobody knows my sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Glory, hallelujah. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord. Sometimes I'm level to the ground. Oh, yes, Lord. And then I would call on the psych majors and say, talk about this for a minute. And they go, that sounds like clinical depression. You know, all of a sudden they would recognize that in those songs. And yet people, we now know from some of the work that's been done on trauma that singing and movement are healing pathways to trauma. So these folks were doing it before we had clinical license to do it. Again, now let me be a good Baptist and make 4 points and then sit down. Okay, point number one. Saunders Redding wrote a book titled, They Came in Chains. And we need to say, they came in chains and they came singing. We under-theorize the cultural capital that Africans brought to the New World. Probably the first I heard of the spirituals was listening to my mother and my grandmother talk about the possibility of losing the tradition. My grandmother, I had a grandmother who was born in 1883 in Georgia. Her sister was born in 1880, and I had my great aunt until she was 98, and I had my grandmother was, I think, 94 when we lost her. But anyway, I was an only child for 8 years, and this is sort of like how I learned to be a good ethnographer. You hang out with adults when you're an only child, and then you learn if they spell in front of you. Don't shout out the words after you've sounded them out in your head, because then you get to keep listening and find out things. I once made a whole congregation glower at me when I told the kids, when the adults spell in front of you, don't say the words out loud. And you could see their parents going, and you could see the little kids going, okay, how to survive as a child and learn adult business without getting into trouble. And her own mother was born in bondage. The woman who helped to raise my mother was born in slavery, okay? Her own mother was born in bondage, and that same mother moved to Philadelphia and raised my mother and aunts until she passed away in 1928. My great-grandmother's parents had tried to prevent her running away to get married. After she left them in Macon and moved to Savannah, these formerly enslaved parents convinced my born in slavery great-grandmother to send the next baby home to keep us company. The next baby after that one was my grandmother, and her mother was my great aunt, and her mother moved to Philadelphia to help her with the children. My grandmother, and people would ask her, they go, "Are you from the South?" And she'd go, "Yes, and I intend to stay from the South." And it wasn't until the movie Daughters of the Dust came out that I had a real revelation on my grandmother's origins, because when she didn't want me to know what she was saying, I realized now she would speak in Gullah. And somehow she managed to change her speech patterns in such a way that other African Americans would ask her if she was from the South. That's scary, okay? I haven't fully figured that out yet. But my grandmother, who intended to stay from the South, adopted what Richard Long would view as a citadin cultural orientation. Check out Richard Long, folk rural, folk urban, citadin, trans-African, etc. Okay. In spite of her emphasis on classical cultural exposure for her daughters, my grandmother did not view the spirituals as some folk rural cultural relic to be discarded and dismissed. She mentioned their importance constantly, and expressed appreciation for a Jewish neighbor who also talked about their importance as a cultural gift to the world. Note, European recognition of African American musical genius is most often associated with people from Eastern Europe, an area of the world where the blue note is part of the folk and classical music. I used to tell my students, instead of dividing human beings up by the color, let's divide them up by the scales they sing and see what we end up with. Mm-hmm. Roland Kirk, I don't know how many of you know the jazz musician Roland Kirk. If you haven't heard him, go hear him. And a piano player from Montenegro were getting ready to riff on Antonin Dvorak's Going Home. And so, and you could hear this back and forth. And Roland Kirk said, "Some say Dvorak was a white man. Some say he was a black man. Well, what do you say?" I say, "I don't give a damn. Let's play the song." Okay. It was one of the stories that was told and retold on my mother's side of the family. A few other Southern ways were mentioned as part of my carefully curated childhood. For instance, the shared transracial value of etiquette. Other than that, my grandmother was very classic. But my consciousness of the spirituals and my enthusiasm for music in general made waiting until I was old enough, remember waiting till I was old enough to join the junior choir, seem like forever. When I was 10 years old, I wanted to invite two of my white Catholic friends. This is Cambridge, Massachusetts. All the Black folks were Protestant and all the white folks were Catholic or Orthodox. And I was inviting them to come to my church because, I visited all these churches with the choir. I was sure they could come to church. So I asked my friends, I said, "I want you to come and visit my church." And they said, "We can't come to your church. The priest won't let us." And my response was, "Don't tell the priest." that didn't work. They said, oh, we'll go to hell. And I can remember standing by a tree on Flag Street in Cambridge going, thank you, Jesus, for making me colored so I can have all this good music. Remember, this is 1957, 58. Okay, we were still Negro in color. So the first point is, yes, they came in chains, and they came singing, and they came making knowledge, and they came using the things that they know to begin to survive and thrive in this new world. Point 2, cultural capital and interfaith negotiation, interpretation and community building. If we take what we now know 50 years after Blasingame, 50 years after Cone, if we now look at the state of current research on African origins and slave communities in North America, and yes, I'm being very specific with North America, spirituals are a gift from those enslaved in the US to the world. If we take seriously what we now think we know, representatives of at least 44 different African cultures or nations at different times and places interacted, in the words of Michael Gomez, exchanged their country marks to create African American culture. It was perhaps, and I argue this in the work I'm doing on the role of Muslims in shaping African American Christianity, it was probably the greatest interfaith conversation that has ever taken place in the world. While we focus on the hegemonic role of Christianity, what Rabbitoe and others call slave religion is a resistant and critical response to European Christianity and its valorization of slavery. 10 to 18% of the folks who got off the boat in Charleston, in Maryland, and in Savannah knew who Moses was. They knew, and they could right away say, they're not telling us everything, okay? 2 of my current research writing projects focus on the creation of religious knowledge and practice, cultural production among the enslaved. We have voices conscious of their African origins who tell us about this interpretive process in their music and their folklore. And there's the University of North Carolina has a website where you can go on and read all of these slave narratives. And it's amazing in the first few paragraphs of how many slave narratives these folks know their grandparents or parents' African origins and mention them in the beginning. No, they didn't forget. Hello. Let me skip over something, go to point. So remember, interfaith conversation and interpretation, negotiating diversity at the very beginning, what Mintz and Price talk about as ritual exchange in the making of African American culture in the New World. And when Mintz and Price are talking about African American culture, they're talking about North America, South America, and the Caribbean. Okay. 3rd point. The Bible serves as a libretto for liberation. Somewhere in Jim Cone's papers, there is a cassette. My work on the Blessed Book, the Bible as an African American, the Bible and the African American cultural imagination. The basic theory for the book is that the orature, I borrowed this term orature from the work of African critic Chinwe, that the orature represents what I call a prophetic apocalyptic reading of the Bible. Prophetic in that it challenges power. It says something's wrong. Go down, Moses, let my people go. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Although when you have a sort of post-Holocaust consciousness, reading the book of Joshua in seminary can be a bit of a challenge. Anyway, I got through it with my sanity intact. But anyway, there's the prophetic, and then there's the apocalyptic. This mess has got to end. So there's 2 themes, and then underneath it is also a stream of perseverance discourse. How do you stand the storm? How do you do like Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson did last week and hold your peace and let the Lord fight your battle? You know, I mean, she did it. Okay, I'm getting goosebumps now. Let me not. But this prophetic apocalyptic reading can be found in the music. And one of the nice things about being a DJ is you get to use the music as data, and you have, when you're thinking about a question, you just have a thematic program and play the music that has to do with the theme, right? And so when I was telling Jim about the apocalyptic, he said, he asked me to send him a tape of my apocalyptic show. So somewhere in his papers, there's a cassette tape of one of my shows, The Uncloudy Day with Dr. Cheryl, 2 hours of good news power for your gospel music listening on WMHB Waterville, 89.7 FM. And for our friends on the worldwide, you get the point. And so he has that because of, there's a reading, one of the chapters in the book is going to be talking about the book of Revelation as a libretto for liberation. 12 gates to the city. Hello? 3 gates in the east, 3 gates in the west, 3 gates. Okay, all right, you get the point. And then point 4, the music still matters. Why? Because it's the cuts that we bleed through. Thank you, Common and John Legend. Music is a source of identification with the great literary productions that emerged from musical voices preserving and carrying oral tradition. Teaching African American studies, especially my Impossible General course, forced me to start watching the Grammys and some other music award shows. I watched them not only to see who and what wins, but also to observe the different presentations of self of artists, especially Black and white artists. There was one iteration of the Grammys one year, it seemed like all of the white artists were in denim and denim jackets, and all of the Black artists were wearing white like they were in church. It was amazing visuals, okay? Using the cultural exposure theory of Black parents, grandparents, and church ladies, I also forced students to read the souls of Black folk, as well as hearing the spirituals. I once began an iteration of my course, African American Religious Experience in the United States, with the opening sentence, "The music still matters." And I used Du Bois's essay of the Faith of the Fathers as a theoretical starting point for the course. And in it, Du Bois identifies the music as a foundational component. One of the final exam questions is asking the students to talk back to Du Bois and suggest revisions. And one of the revisions they're supposed to suggest, if they've been listening, is that it needs to be retitled "Of the Faith of the Mothers and the Fathers." But anyway, Cohn argues persuasively that this music is a knowledge. It is a knowledge that requires deep scholarly exploration. The spirituals in the blues takes our understanding of these spirituals to a new level. In the 50 years since its first publication, we have learned a lot more about slavery, about African American history, about African history, about the specificities of African capture, and about the impact of trauma and its healing. With all that has been learned, Cohn's book stands as an enduring witness to the durability and the universality of the message that these people, these enslaved people, had for the world. African Americans are still negotiating our diversity in sacred spaces, and that diversity is still tied to our music. In the words of John Legend and Common, our music is the cuts that we bleed through. Since 1972, the music world has changed, especially with the birth of hip hop. Icons of hip hop, for instance, Beyonce and Snoop Dogg, still reach to their roots, singing and sampling spirituals. In an album titled Bible of Love, Snoop Dogg includes both a gospel song titled Change the World and a spiritual he titles Going Home, one that is more often titled Soon I Will Be Done with the Troubles of This World, Going Home to Live with God. And it confronts the reality of death. That particular set of musical choices reminds us of the truth that Cohn argues the blues people represent. They are looking for a home that is earthly and eschatological. Home could only be freedom. Did you see the Grammys Sunday night? Freedom. And the will to create a new world for the people I love. The spirituals still matter very much for Black lives and for a world that still troubles the mind and the soul. Some ask, what is the lasting significance of Cohn's work on understanding how hope and humanity are expressed in Black culture and serve as an expression of spirituality, resistance, transcendence against ongoing dehumanization and oppression? 50 years after publication, Cone's work remains an enduring witness about spirituals and blues, and it is a guide to asking new and more creative questions about Black music and Black theology and origin stories in the face of social change and racist reaction. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Gilks for that amazing, amazing lecture, for your erudition, for the comprehensive scope of your knowledge, for your humor, for your storytelling, for your analytic capacity, for your grasp of history, for the way you weave together interdisciplinary insights, for the theological depths to which you take us. The list could go on. That was amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the next part of our evening, our conversation, Dr. Timothy Levi Atkins Jones. He is the pastor of the historic Bethany Baptist Church in Newark and professor of homiletics at Union Theological Seminary. We got more Baptists up here than Episcopalians.
Amen.
Oh,
Amen.
what's that going to mean? I know there are a lot more. All right, that's a whole other conversation we can have here. Reverend Atkins Jones is also the director of Union's new track, new certificate in religion and the Black experience, something we're very proud of, and perhaps he can say some more about this. He is the son of the church. He was led to faith in Christ at an early age by his grandfather, the Reverend Leroy Jones, at Pilgrim Journey Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia. And before being called to Bethany, he faithfully led congregations in Massachusetts and Connecticut, building a young legacy of community activism and Christian service, which he carries with him still today. He has a PhD in practical theology with homiletics concentration from BU, a BA from Amherst, and an MDiv from Boston University. He is a sought-out lecturer, speaker across the nation. He has taught all over the place. His broadcasts on Sirius XM, entitled Urban View, is a much listened to, and he continues to serve his alma mater, Amherst College, as a graduate fellow. There's so much more to be said about Timothy Atkins Jones, but he is the perfect person to moderate our conversation this evening with Dr. Gilks. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim for the conversation to come.
Thank you so much, President Jones. We put our hands together again, and not only for President Jones, but for Dr. Gilks. Thank you so much for your lecture today. I've been such a great fan of your work for many years, particularly being able to witness you not only be the sort of best of the academy, but also to continue to maintain, to minister in the local church. And so that's something I've always been someone that attempts to do that. I've always been greatly honored by and watching that witness. So thank you for that. Let me just say thank you for that personally.
You're welcome.
Let me also say, as someone who went to Amherst and played basketball, that you are indeed the only good thing that is at Colby College. Amen. For they are indeed stark rivals. Amen.
We've expanded.
If a few more things. All right.
Okay. No,
Those Maine winters are rough on somebody coming up the way, but we'll talk about that another time. There are quite a few questions that have come in, and I had some questions that I wanted to sort of start us off with. And one of those centers in and around the church. One of the things that you mentioned was a kind of revival of the spirituals in the academy and in study. But I wanted to ask your opinion on the revival of the relevance of spirituals in the Black church specifically, and even more contextually located in where we are today on what we hope and pray is the back end of this pandemic, and thinking about all of the grief that is yet to be dealt with, yet to be moved through. How might a recovery of the spirituals help us make sense of this senseless pain?
Part of it, when you mention all the grief that has to do with the pandemic, one of the things that I do as not only a minister in my local church, which is assist when you're not the pastor, you do as pastor asks. And those of you who know African-American churches, how that works. But I participate in funerals, and sometimes I end up doing the graveside service. In some cases, I end up having to put together funerals. And I've discovered during the pandemic, and this pandemic has wreaked havoc with our traditional ways of grieving. That, in the old days, it was 3, 4, 5 days at the most, a wake, a funeral, and a graveside service with a repast back at the, with the family. And now we're talking 2 weeks out. We're talking most people, New York had its crisis. And I can remember at the beginning, in fact, one of my dear friends, who was a Presbyterian pastor here in New York, her sister was a member of our church, and she passed away here. And so the whole grief process. But when you're putting together funerals for people who may not be churched, you discover what's important, and the music matters. The music matters. I used the phrase "something bumping." I had to put together a funeral for a family, and because of the lack of control of schedules, this is the other thing. Because of the lack of control of schedules, you can't always get a soloist. You can't always get a musician. Because of and then I had, when you have people who are unchurched, sometimes they don't always choose the funeral director that your church prefers. So you find yourself working with funeral directors who don't know the African-American tradition. And so I found thank God for my experience as a DJ, because I was able to put together playlists for people, and I could listen to and hear the themes. And people, even if, and just because they're unchurched does not mean they don't know Jesus. This is the other thing. And sometimes you have people who pass away who I call, especially women who are non-sectarian Christians. So much so that they know ministers, and their family members end up having to sort of fight off volunteers because of their outstanding work in the community. But what I've learned over these past 2 years is that the music matters, and that the songs, if they're not traditional hymns, they're gospel songs that are grounded in the spirituals. One of the things I think we need to do as a church is to better educate, because if you have a church with a large number of students who've gone to historically Black colleges, they know the music. They know the music. They know the arranged tradition, and they also may know the folk traditions. But if you have children who have grown up in the North and have not had that exposure, we need to take seriously our role in churches and re-educate our communities, because as my grandmother was concerned, we could lose this tradition. People don't even realize that, and everybody sings them. This is the other thing that's important. When Marian Anderson sang in Russia, she gave a concert one time. She always ended her concerts with spirituals. And she had sung Heaven, Heaven, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. That was one of the songs that she had sung. And she left the stage and there was no applause. And she thought she had failed. And then in her autobiography, she talks about hearing what happened was the audience rushed the stage and started pounding on the stage saying, heaven, heaven, heaven. They wanted her to come back and sing it again. Yeah. Maya Angelou gives this story in, I forget which volume it's in. She traveled with the State Department. The State Department would send African-American musicians and singers to help fight the Cold War. I mean, we are going through it right now. Okay. And she was in Poland and she wasn't supposed to leave the hotel, you know, because you're being shepherded by the State Department. But Maya Angelou never obeyed people. And she went out wandering and she walked into a store that was a cleaning establishment. And they didn't speak English and she didn't speak Polish. And the owner started shouting. She had no idea what he was shouting. But all of a sudden his wife and 8 children come running out. And they're talking rapidly in Polish. And then all of a sudden they look at her and go, Paul Robeson, and sing a perfect rendition in English of Deep River. Okay. So we need to reappreciate and educate and not depend upon other institutions besides the church. We need to reclaim our educational role. Dr. King, in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And I actually quote this section of his book on my syllabus. I should say I'm on my way to retirement, so I quoted, I can talk in past tense now, this section of the book where he talks about he and his wife going to a concert on music in the Americas that was being performed by the children in his newly desegregated school in Atlanta. And they sang all of these music traditions from the various immigrant groups and not one single song from the African-American tradition, not one single spiritual. And remember, Mrs. Coretta Scott King was a fully educated, not only in performance studies, but in music education. And he writes about this, and he actually talks about cultural erasure as a form of racism in this chapter, and what it meant for the miseducation, not only of the Black children, but also of the white children. So so we need to reclaim this. And remember, he would end his sermons, he was always quoting a spiritual. Dave Garrett very dismissively and derisively complains about this constant reference to certain songs at the end of his sermons. But he's uplifting and utilizing this tradition of spirituals, very important to him.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's a question that just came in that actually is right along the line of something I was thinking. And so I'll set it up by saying a little while ago, I used a prayer from recently deceased rapper DMX at some point in church service, and people received it well. I got a call from the chair of my deacon board asking about said prayer, and I was, as you might know, I was a little concerned. I was like, oh, maybe the chair was a little, upset about me, referencing this rapper. But actually, he was quite moved by the prayer and wanted to know the reference and where to find other prayers from DMX over time. And so I think it speaks to this almost lack of distinction between the sacred and the secular. And so one of the questions just came in is along those lines, and it says, one of the divisions between generations and religious approaches, especially among Black folk, is differing stances on a division of sacred and secular. Can you tease out a little more what we learned about the relationship between the two from your perspective and Dr. Cohn's, rather than drawing a line in the sand between the two?
Well, one time my student, having to teach my students about religion, I mean, if you can imagine teaching this course, one of the texts that I used was a book called The Black Book. And the editor for that project was Toni Morrison. She's not the author, but she's the editor. And some of the headings have spirituals, fragments of spirituals. And so I would have to explain to students who these people were, that, who is Joshua, who is Samson. I actually had to explain who Moses was one time in class. So it was, this is the kind of thing. But I get a knock on the door. One of the reasons I started watching the Grammys was I get a knock on the door from a student. He comes in, professor. They had been assigned to read Du Bois, where Du Bois talks about the people who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. Okay, the valley. Okay, I said, Professor, I want you to hear this. This artist is using Du Bois for his song, and he brought the cassette tape. You can tell how far back that was. He brought the cassette tape, and so we put the cassette into my cassette player in the office. And next thing you know, boom, the boom, boom, the boom. As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at
and realize there's nothing left. Yeah.
At which point I had to reach over and grab the Bible off the shelf and show him that Du Bois and Coolio were drawing from the same way. But in a way, it was a blessing to have to explain that stuff, because they would ask, well, how do you tell the difference when it's sacred and secular? Part of it is setting. And remember, I mentioned the hands. People would grab your hands if you started clicking your fingers, snapping your fingers, and then you learn to clap. So you sort of learn, and this is where the construction, the social construction of the sacred and secular matters. Folks know how to socialize you. My grandmother, I found out later, she was also a Baptist missionary. So she's, when Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham was talking about these women between 1880 and 1920, my grandmother was one of them. She was born in 1883, and by 1920, she had her children, and she was a member of Ena Tabernacle Baptist Church. And my mother told me, she was and my mother happened to mention one time that my grandmother knew all the words to this, and I can't remember, it's a song with a title. I've got to look it up and do research on it, because I'm trying to write about this stuff, about this rambler, but she knew all the words. So the fact that people dress up on Sunday doesn't mean that they're not listening to and hearing the music on Saturday, on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Wild Women Don't Have the Blues. I highly recommend the film, and also I think it's Pearl Harrison. Don't hold me to it, but look up. There's a book by that title, and there's a film that goes with it. And they interview these blues singers, and one of the things that happens in our churches is that, and one of the reasons that we sort of win a lot with our music is because it's the one space that doesn't try to stop you from developing. They let you sing early. Mrs. Freeland made us wait until we were 8 years old to join the junior choir. As soon as my friends got power in their churches, there was no age limit on joining the junior choir. And I have seen choirs where there was one church we went to, there must have been about 60 children in this choir. Some of them were so little that the big children had to pick them up and set them down. And you could tell from the bulge that they were still toddlers. But they knew how to look at the choir director and wait for her signal, even the little tiny people. And they sang this rendition of Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. It was, and it doesn't mean that as teenagers, we don't go and do the secular stuff. I had to explain a slow drag to this child in class, but I knew, and the love of my man, and it was like, okay, I'm not singing the love of my God. It was just too close, as the old song said. But it is a matter of social construction of meaning, the way in which the community guides and directs. And folks, and to give you an idea, one time we took our children, our church went to a play that there's a play that has Dr. King having a conversation the night before his assassination. I can't remember the name of the play. The night before his assassination, and he's talking to the housekeeper at the Lorraine Motel. And in that play, there's, some swear words and stuff like that.
Sure.
So when we were leaving, one of the church members was looking at all the kids and they would say, well, I'm not sure that this language was good for them. So I stopped them in the hallway and said, okay, kids, how many of you have heard anything in that play that you hadn't heard before? And these are all little kids, right? They said, we heard it all. And then one of them pipes up in the background, sometimes we hear it at home. So that was the end of that discussion. I got the pastor out of hot water. But the thing is that because they are going in and out of spaces, they know the difference between sacred and secular. Sure. And as long as it's taught, when people don't pay attention to it, that's when things get a little crazy. One time the gospel choir at my school at Kobe, I was out of town and they said, oh, we sang. I said, what did you sing? They said, we sang Spirit in the Dark. And I'm going, that's not gospel. But they thought it was. And the choir director is now an ordained minister. So obviously it wasn't, a total disaster.
They made it through.
So anyway, but the way in which we use cultural material to preach, I can put together a sermon on Spirit in the Dark, night visions and all that good
Absolutely.
stuff. Yeah. Okay.
There are a few questions about like themes as found in the spirituals, theological themes and otherwise. Here's one that asks, can you say a bit more about home as it relates to Black music, especially spirituals? In these songs, home is not here for us. It said that we're always on the run, fugitives in this country, et cetera. If home is freedom here? So just about home and how home presents itself as a theme in the spirituals.
This is where you have to take Du Bois seriously on this one ever feels his two-ness. And, it's both and. It's both and. In the same way that spirituals sometimes were signal songs, swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Home, freedom. Also, home, if I pass away, do I go back over, cross back over the water? The all sorts of questions about what the eschaton is. But it's all of those things. It's not just either or. Freedom can be here if we are pushing for it. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Why not everyone, every man? You remember the inclusive language is a late 20th century thing. I have to get students to read Du Bois inclusively because there's a temptation to over masculinize our interpretation of his work when he's actually talking about humanity, right? But didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Why not everyone? See, people are asking that question. And so, yes, the home is freedom.
Sure.
And home, and where is freedom? Do I have to escape to another place? And the irony is that we as African Americans, I don't know, this is where that one ever feels one's two-ness with Du Bois. As I watch the current news, and I realize that I'm looking at the death and destruction in Eastern Europe, and realizing the death and destruction that people were running from when they came north to get out of the South, that death and destruction was what they were running from. And yet there was no one to welcome them, no one to take them in. This constant attempt to interpret all of this is tied to that.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, home is over there. but home can be here if we engage in struggle, and we must, and sometimes it's, as one spiritual said, like a little inch more, that persevering, pressing on. Yeah.
Bit by bit. We're running right up on our time. I want to ask one questions for information's sake, and then allow you to close. So there was a question about, can you give us the title and the author of the book that you mentioned that gave the appendix of all of the Black churches?
Oh, Traveling On, The Slave's Journey to an Afro-Baptist Faith by Michelle Sobel. Traveling On, The Slave's Journey to an Afro-Baptist Faith. I told you there were more Baptists. Yeah. Which is why sometimes anyway, let me not digress here. But the appendix, she saved me years of work, because my work on some of the work that I do is on what African Americans call the Sanctified Church, holiness, Pentecostal, apostolic, deliverance, denominations and congregations. That's the African American collective term for that. When we're trying to figure out who we are and where we're from, we'll meet and somebody will say, well, what church do you go to? Oh, I'm over in the Sanctified Church. And they'll know that there's two options to what they've said. One, you keep on talking and they'll know, well, they just know I'm over in that church where the ladies wear uniforms and we have tambourines and drums, etc. Or you respond, which one? And then there is this complicated conversation about church history. And this is folk conversation. These are not scholars, but talking about the different churches and how my church, people know their church. And what's his name? Black Gods of the Metropolis pointed out, Zora Neale Hurston calls the emergence of the Sanctified Church as a music-making movement. And Arthur Huff Fawcett talks about the emergence of these churches as sort of graduate church within the African American experience. So all of that is happening, but people, which one? And then people spend time locating one another in these church places. Well, in starting to do that research, part of the question I was asking was, what happened to slave religion? How was it connected? And Michelle Sobel's appendix, when I hit Mount Helm Baptist Church in Mississippi, and it was the same part of the same association out of which Charles Harrison Mason came, there was a connection because it was Black pastored and independent 30 years before the end of slavery. Wow. 30 years before the end of slavery. And one of the things that she points out in this book, at some times and under some conditions, and you have white interests that are not necessarily slave-owning interests. And Du Bois points out that we talk about the South as if there were two categories of people in the South, the enslavers and the enslaved. He talks about this at the end of Black Reconstruction in America. The majority of white people did not own slaves. Parenthesis, their descendants gave us Trump. But that's another story, okay. But those white Baptists, who very often, their church origins were when they left the biracial churches, which is why you go to some Southern towns and cities and First Baptist Church is the Black church, not the white church. But they valued congregational independence and autonomy so much, they facilitated Black congregations maintaining that autonomy. The reason they passed laws against unsupervised slave worship in the South is because it was already happening. The reason they passed laws against literacy is because it was already happening. Read the laws and then say, what were Black folks doing? And so that list that she gives, that appendix that she gives, tells about the connections about this invisible church that also had formally organized congregations that were already in motion, which was why people were able to send pastoral leaders to talk to Sherman and say, we want land. Okay, so making sense of that complexity becomes an important part. And that book, the hardcover, they republished it with in paperback, and they didn't include the appendix. But you want to see the hardcover version.
Absolutely. Dr. Jills, thank you.
You're
You are a wealth of knowledge and wisdom. You are indeed a theologian, and we thank you for that. And we're grateful for your time. Come on, we put our hands together as we're grateful for Dr. Jills. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to invite everyone to a reception in the back as we celebrate this amazing discussion, this incredible lecture, and the legacy of James Cone.
Yes.
And there's no better way to honor that than to celebrate what has transpired here tonight. So amen, and have a glass of wine. Not a very Baptist thing to say.
Oh, no, that's very